Small towns are known for their charm and quiet streets, but sometimes they hide the darkest secrets imaginable. These 5 spine-chilling stories dive into the mysteries lurking just below the surface, from a cursed house that devours those who dare to enter, to a gas station encounter with a stranger who knows more than he should, to a haunting figure that stalks the woods, a diner that disappears without a trace, and an abandoned church echoing with sinister whispers. Each story unravels a piece of the terrifying unknown. Prepare yourself for the kind of small-town horror that will haunt your thoughts long after the video ends. When the lights flickered inside the abandoned church on the edge of town, I thought I'd imagined it. I wish I had. My name's Dan, and I've been a handyman in my small town for most of my life. It's not glamorous, but I've always taken pride in my work. If something needed fixing, I was the guy people called. That's how I ended up at St. Mary's Church, a crumbling old building on the outskirts of town. Everyone in town knew about the church, but not in a good way. It had been abandoned for decades, long enough for moss to climb the stone walls and for the stained glass windows to grow cloudy with grime. People whispered about the place, calling it cursed. They said the priest who used to run it vanished one night after claiming he'd seen the devil. I always chalked it up to small-town gossip. So when the mayor called me and asked if I could check out the place, I didn't think twice. "We're selling the property," he explained. "But the buyers want it inspected first. See what you can do about the wiring and plumbing while you're there." The job sounded simple enough. I packed up my tools and drove out the next morning. The church sat at the end of a long, overgrown road surrounded by dense woods. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to feel. By the time I pulled up to the building, I had an odd sense of being watched. Shaking it off, I grabbed my flashlight and toolbox and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell: dust, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. The sunlight filtering through the dirty windows gave the place a dim, hazy glow. The pews were still there, covered in a thick layer of dust, and the altar stood at the far end, its white cloth now a mottled grey. "Just a building," I muttered, trying to push past the unease creeping up my spine. I started with the electrical system. The wiring was ancient, frayed in places, but surprisingly intact. As I worked, I kept hearing noises, soft creaks and faint rustling sounds that seemed to come from all around me. At first, I dismissed it as the building settling. Old places like this always made noise. But then I heard footsteps. They were faint, like someone walking slowly across the wooden floorboards. I froze, holding my breath, and shone my flashlight around the room. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed back, but there was no reply. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal and went back to work. That's when I noticed something strange. Tucked between the pews were small slips of paper, scattered like leaves. I picked one up. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in dark ink. "Forgive me, Father. I didn't mean to see it." Another note read, "Deliver us from evil. Please, God, help us." As I moved through the church, I found more of them. Pleas for forgiveness, prayers for protection, all written in the same desperate hand. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself they were just old notes left behind by frightened parishioners. Then I heard it, a faint melodic sound coming from above me. A choir. It was distant, muffled, and eerie, voices harmonizing in a hymn I didn't recognize. I looked up, shining my flashlight toward the ceiling. The choir loft was empty, the wood warped and sagging. The music stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving me in silence. I decided to finish up as quickly as possible. The plumbing was next, which meant heading into the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath. The basement was a maze of stone walls and low ceilings, with old storage rooms branching off in every direction. One door stood out. It was heavy and wooden, with rusted hinges and a padlock hanging loosely from the latch. According to the blueprints I'd studied earlier, the door shouldn't have led anywhere. The basement was supposed to end at a solid stone wall, but a cold draft seeped through the cracks, and when I pressed my ear to the door I heard whispers. They were faint but unmistakable, a chorus of voices murmuring in unison. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a crowbar from my toolbox and pried the lock open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward into pitch blackness. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness as I descended. The air was damp and carried the unmistakable smell of decay. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a large circular room. The walls were lined with stone coffins, each one marked with symbols I didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood an altar, blackened and cracked, as if it had been scorched by fire. Strange carvings covered its surface, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive hum. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw shadows moving along the walls, shapes that didn't match my own. I backed away, my heart racing, but the staircase was gone. The door I'd entered through was now a solid wall of stone. Panic set in as the whispers turned into screams, angry, anguished cries that echoed around me. I stumbled backward, my hands clawing at the walls, desperate for an exit. Suddenly, the altar erupted in flames, casting the room in a hellish red glow. A shadow rose from the fire, tall and featureless, its presence suffocating. "Leave," it growled, its voice deep and guttural. The next thing I knew, I was outside. I was lying on the ground, staring up at the church's rotting steeple. My tools were scattered around me, and my flashlight was shattered. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? But something's been off ever since. Every time I pass a mirror, I can't shake the feeling that my reflection isn't quite right. It moves when I do, sure, but there's something wrong in its eyes, something watching me. I've stopped looking at mirrors altogether, but at night I swear I can feel it staring back at me. I didn't believe the stories about the old diner on Route 27. Then one night I saw it for myself. I've been a traveling salesman for most of my adult life. The long hours on the road don't bother me much, but the stretches of desolation can get to you, especially late at night. That's why I never turned down a chance to stop for a cup of coffee and a bite to eat. It was past midnight, and I was driving through a particularly barren part of the state. Route 27 is one of those roads that seems to go on forever, surrounded by endless fields and thick patches of forest. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and my eyelids were starting to droop. That's when I saw it. A brightly lit diner, glowing like a beacon in the darkness. It was strange. I'd driven this route dozens of times and had never noticed a diner before. But exhaustion and hunger outweighed curiosity, so I pulled into the gravel lot. The place was picture perfect, like something out of the 1950s. A gleaming chrome exterior, neon signs buzzing softly, and a big sign that read, "Betty's Diner, open 24/7. The parking lot was nearly full, though I hadn't seen any cars on the road. I walked in, and a bell chimed above the door. The inside was just as pristine. Checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and a long counter with polished stools. The air smelled like fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. "Welcome, hun." A cheerful waitress greeted me with a bright smile, her red lipstick perfectly applied. She wore a retro uniform, complete with a frilly apron and a little hat perched on her blonde curls. Thanks," I said, a bit taken aback. "Take a seat anywhere," she said, gesturing to the booths. I slid into one near the window and glanced around. The place was almost full, but the other patrons didn't look at me. They sat silently, eating or staring into their coffee cups. Their faces were pale, their movements mechanical. The waitress returned with a menu. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee for now," I said, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. I scanned the room again. Something felt off. The patrons weren't talking, not even to the staff. One man in a suit sat across from an untouched plate of pancakes, his gaze fixed on the table. A couple in the corner held hands, but didn't exchange a word. I chalked it up to my imagination and fatigue. After all, I'd been driving for hours, and this was just some quirky roadside diner. The coffee arrived, steaming and black. I took a sip and immediately felt more awake. It was perfect, strong, rich, and exactly what I needed. But as I drank, I noticed something strange. The waitress was watching me. She stood behind the counter, her cheerful smile frozen in place, her eyes unblinking. I tried to shrug it off, but then I realized the other patrons were watching me too. Slowly, subtly, their heads turned toward me, their blank expressions unreadable. "Can I get you anything else, hon?" the waitress asked, her voice too sweet, too rehearsed. No, I'm good," I stammered. She nodded, still smiling, and walked away. But her eyes lingered on me for just a second too long. I decided it was time to leave. I tossed a few bills on the table and headed for the door, avoiding the stares of the patrons. The bell chimed as I stepped outside, and I hurried to my car. But when I turned to look back at the diner, it was gone. The bright lights, the neon sign, the chrome exterior, all of it had vanished. In its place was an overgrown lot, weeds choking the cracked pavement. My car was the only one there. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The coffee cup I'd brought with me was still warm in my hand, the logo Betty's Diner printed on the side. I got in my car and drove off, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, but that wasn't the end of it. A few weeks later, I found myself on Route 27 again. I hadn't planned on taking that road, but a detour forced me back onto it. As I drove through the same stretch of desolation, I saw it again, Betty's Diner glowing brightly in the darkness. This time, I didn't stop. I drove past, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw the waitress standing outside waving at me with that same frozen smile. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I started asking around about the diner. Most people said they'd never heard of it, but one older man at a gas station gave me a knowing look. "Betty's, huh? Yeah, I've heard the stories," he said. "It burned down years ago. Some kind of accident in the kitchen. People say you still see it sometimes, late at night. But you're better off staying away." "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "They say it's not really there. Or if it is, you might not come back out." Despite the warning, I couldn't let it go. On my next trip, I decided to stop again, determined to figure out the truth. The diner was exactly as I remembered it, pristine, welcoming, and completely out of place. The same waitress greeted me, her smile as bright and unsettling as ever. "Back so soon," she said. My blood ran cold. How did she recognize me? I hadn't even gone inside last time. I sat at the counter this time, watching her every move. The other patrons were still unnervingly silent, their gazes fixed on me. When I couldn't take it anymore, I stood up and headed for the kitchen. "Employees only, hun," the waitress called after me, her voice sharp. I ignored her and pushed through the swinging doors. The kitchen was nothing like the rest of the diner. It was a blackened, burnt-out shell with charred walls and piles of rubble. The air was thick with the smell of ash and something sickly sweet. In the center of the room was a counter, and on it sat a leather-bound journal. I opened it, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, every conversation I'd ever had, every thought I'd ever voiced aloud. The last entry read, "He's here. We'll make him stay." I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see the patrons standing in the doorway, their blank faces twisted into smiles. The waitress stepped forward holding a steaming cup of coffee. "We're always open for you," she said. The next thing I knew, I was on the side of the road, my car parked on the shoulder. The diner was gone again, replaced by the empty lot. I haven't seen Betty's since, but I get postcards in the mail now, all signed by the staff. The latest one arrived yesterday. It said, "Come back soon, we'll save your seat." I grew up next to those woods, but after what I saw that night, I've never gone back and never will. Our town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nothing much happened, so the few local legends we had took on a life of their own. The most infamous was about the Watcher in the woods. According to the stories, the Watcher was a tall, shadowy figure that guarded the forest. They said if you went too far in, you'd see it watching you from between the trees. Sometimes it followed people home, and sometimes they didn't come back at all. Most of us didn't take it seriously, but my best friend Danny and I were curious kids. We were 12 at the time, too young to know better, too old to let a scary story keep us away. It started with a dare. We were sitting on my porch watching the sun set over the tree line when Danny leaned in, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Let's find the Watcher," he said. I laughed it off, but he wouldn't let it go. "Come on, Josh, we'll just go a little way in. If we don't see anything, we'll come right back." He knew I hated being called a chicken, and I wasn't about to let him win. So as the last light faded, we grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods. The forest was quiet at first, just the sound of leaves crunching under our feet and the distant hoot of an owl. But as we got deeper, something changed. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of branches, the chirping of insects, had faded away. All we could hear was the sound of our breathing and the occasional snap of a twig. "See that?" Danny whispered, shining his flashlight on a tree trunk. At first, I didn't know what he was talking about. Then I saw it. A series of deep, jagged marks gouged into the bark, like claw marks. They were fresh, the wood underneath pale and splintered. We looked around, but there was no sign of an animal or anything else that could have made them. "Weird," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Danny grinned. "Maybe it's the Watcher." We kept going, following what looked like a faint trail of broken branches. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then we found the campsite. It was abandoned, the tent half collapsed and covered in leaves. Inside, there were sleeping bags shredded to pieces, like something had torn through them. A rusted lantern lay on its side, and the ground was littered with bits of clothing and old rotting food. "This is freaky," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Danny was quiet, his flashlight sweeping over the scene. "Whoever was here left in a hurry," he said finally. That's when we heard it. A low rustling sound, coming from somewhere behind us. We froze, our flashlights darting toward the noise. At first, we didn't see anything, but then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements too fast. It darted between the trees, always just out of the light. "Danny," I whispered, my throat dry. "I see it," he said, his voice shaking. The figure stopped, standing perfectly still in the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was gone, but then I realized it was watching us. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. "Let's go," I said, tugging at Danny's sleeve. We started backing away, our flashlights trained on the spot where the figure had been. But when we turned around, it was there, not close, but closer than it had been. We ran. The woods seemed endless, the trees blurring together as we sprinted down the faint trail. The figure followed, always keeping its distance, but never losing us. I could hear its footsteps now, soft but deliberate, as if it wanted us to know it was there. We stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. In the center was a massive tree, its trunk wide and gnarled, its bark covered in carvings, faces, hundreds of them, twisted and screaming, their eyes wide with terror. Some were old and weathered, almost indistinguishable from the bark. Others looked fresh, the lines sharp and deep. "What is this?" Danny whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the figure stepped into the clearing. It was taller than I'd thought, its head nearly brushing the lowest branches of the ancient tree. Its limbs were impossibly long, its skin dark and rough like bark, but it was its face that froze me in place. It didn't have one. Instead, it was blank, featureless, except for the faint outlines of a face shifting beneath the surface as if it were trapped just under the skin. It whispered our names. Danny. Josh. I don't remember screaming, but I know we ran. Danny was ahead of me, his flashlight bobbing wildly. I could hear the watcher behind us, its footsteps faster now, more insistent. Then Danny tripped. I heard him hit the ground, his flashlight skittering away. "Josh!" he yelled, his voice desperate. I stopped, torn between helping him and the overwhelming instinct to keep running. Then I heard it, the sound of something heavy dragging across the forest floor, followed by a scream that cut off too quickly. I didn't look back. Somehow, I made it out of the woods. My parents found me on the porch, shaking and covered in dirt. I tried to tell them what happened, but they didn't believe me. Danny was never found. The search parties combed the woods for weeks, but came up empty. They said he must have gotten lost or fallen into a ravine. But I know the truth. Years later, I still dream about those woods, about the Watcher, about Danny's scream. On the anniversary of his disappearance, I woke up to find something outside my window. A tree. It wasn't there before, and its bark was smooth except for one carving. Danny's face staring back at me, his eyes wide with terror. What would you have done? Would you have looked back or kept running? The man who came into my gas station that night wasn't looking for gas or anything I could give. It was a typical late-night shift at the station. Quiet, boring, and stretching into the early hours of the morning. Most nights, I only saw a couple of customers, usually truckers passing through or locals grabbing snacks after a night out. The gas station was on the edge of town, just before the highway opened into miles of emptiness. People said it was a lonely stretch, and they weren't wrong. Some nights the silence felt alive, pressing in around me. But I'd gotten used to it, until that night. It was a little past 2 when he walked in. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Normally the bell above the door would chime, but it didn't. I only realized he was there when I looked up from the counter and saw him standing in the middle of the store. He didn't look like the usual customers. His clothes were old-fashioned, a dark suit with a tie that seemed almost Victorian. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, but the cuffs of his pants were caked with mud. His face was what really unnerved me. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, piercing blue, felt like they were staring straight through me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just browsing," he said, his voice low and smooth. I watched him as he walked down the aisles, his movements deliberate, almost robotic. He didn't pick up anything, didn't even seem to be looking at the shelves. Instead, he glanced around the store like he was studying it. "Long night?" he asked suddenly, his voice startling in the quiet. "Yeah," I said, trying to play it cool. "Just me here until morning." He nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected. Must get lonely. I shrugged, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up my spine. Something about the way he stood, the way he moved, felt wrong. He wandered over to the counter, leaning on it casually. "Do you live far from here?" The question caught me off guard. Not too far," I said. "Close enough to walk," he pressed. I frowned. "Not really. Why?" He smiled again, that same unsettling expression. "Just curious." I wanted to tell him to leave, but something about him made me hesitate. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like a heavy, oppressive feeling, like I was being watched by something far bigger than just a man. "Do you have family?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes unblinking. I froze. "Why do you want to know?" He tilted his head as if the question confused him. "I like to know about the people I meet. You have a wife, don't you? And a little girl?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't mentioned my family, and there was no way he could have known about them. "How do you—" The lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but then the security monitors went static, one by one. The hum of the cooler stopped, and the phone on the counter went dead. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with those piercing eyes. "I wouldn't leave after your shift," he said suddenly. "Not if you want to see them again." "What?" I stammered. He didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the store, the bell still eerily silent. I ran to the door, but when I stepped outside, he was gone. The parking lot was empty and the road stretched out in both directions, dark and deserted. I went back inside, my hands shaking, and tried the phone again. Still dead. The cameras were all static and the lights continued to flicker sporadically. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every sound, every shadow. When my relief finally arrived at 6 a.m., I didn't say a word about what had happened. I just grabbed my stuff and left. The drive home was quiet, the sun just beginning to rise. I told myself it was over, that the man was just some weirdo trying to mess with me. But when I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. My house looked exactly as it had when I left that evening, but all the lights were off and the front door was slightly ajar. I stepped out of the car, calling out for my wife and daughter. No answer. The house was eerily silent as I stepped inside. The air was cold, and there was a faint smell of something metallic, like blood. I checked every room, but they were empty. The beds were made, the breakfast dishes still sitting in the sink. It was as if they'd vanished. I ran back outside, and that's when I saw him. The man from the gas station was standing in the driveway, his hands clasped behind his back, his smile wider than before. "You should have stayed," he said. I blinked, and everything changed. The house was normal again, the lights on, my daughter's laughter ringing out from the backyard. My wife appeared at the door, smiling and waving as if nothing had happened. But something felt wrong, like a dream that's too perfect to believe. I went to work that night, determined to check the security footage from my shift. I needed proof, something to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The footage was there, but it didn't make sense. The cameras showed me standing at the counter, talking, but I was alone. There was no man, no conversation, nothing but me speaking to thin air. I haven't seen the man since, but every night I wonder if I'll find him waiting for me again. And every time the lights flicker, I can't help but think he's already here. When my neighbor disappeared, I knew the old house was involved. I wish I hadn't tried to prove it. I moved to Juniper Lane 2 years ago. It was the kind of small, sleepy neighborhood where nothing ever happened. I liked that. Quiet streets, neat little yards, and just enough space between houses to feel private. The house across the street didn't fit the picture. It was a tall, crumbling Victorian, its windows dark and empty, its yard overgrown with weeds. The locals avoided it, crossing the street rather than walking past. When I asked about it, people shrugged or muttered vague warnings. Bad history, best left alone. The only person who ever mentioned it outright was my neighbor, Mr. Carver. He was a wiry old man who kept to himself, tending his roses and muttering under his breath. We didn't talk much, but one evening, as I was checking my mail, he called out to me. "You're new here," he said, his voice hoarse and low. "Yeah, just moved in," I replied, walking over to his yard. He nodded toward the house across the street. "Stay away from that place. It doesn't like visitors." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. "Why's that?" He squinted at me, his expression unreadable. "It eats people." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and walked back inside. A week later, Mr. Carver disappeared. I noticed when his lawn started growing wild, the once pristine flower beds overtaken by weeds. His mailbox overflowed with junk mail, and his windows stayed dark. The police came and went, but they didn't find anything. No signs of a break-in, no struggle, no clues. It was like he'd just vanished. That's when I started noticing the lights. At night, faint glows flickered in the windows of the old house, soft, pulsing lights, like something alive. I told myself it was just kids sneaking in or maybe the reflection of passing cars. But the lights didn't move like flashlights or headlights. They moved like they had a mind of their own. The sounds came next. Footsteps on my porch, slow and deliberate. I'd rush to the door, but no one would be there. Shadows moved across my yard, long and spindly, though the street was empty. One night, I heard a faint tapping at my window. When I pulled back the curtain, the house across the street was dark, but for a split second I thought I saw someone standing in its doorway. It was enough to drive me mad. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Carver. He'd warned me about the house, and now he was gone. Everyone else seemed content to forget him, but I couldn't. So one night, I decided to find out for myself. I waited until after midnight when the street was quiet. Grabbing a flashlight, I crossed the road and slipped through the rusted gate. The weeds brushed against my legs as I approached the front steps, their creaks piercing the silence. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, filled with the scent of rot and mildew. My flashlight illuminated peeling wallpaper, warped floorboards, and cobwebs that stretched like curtains. "Just a house," I whispered, trying to calm my nerves. But as I moved deeper inside, I realized how wrong I was. The walls weren't normal. They were covered in carvings, thousands of names scratched into the wood and plaster, each one carefully etched. My breath caught in my throat when I saw my own name near the base of the staircase. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard a voice, a faint, muffled sound, like someone calling my name. "Mr. Carver," I whispered, my voice shaking. The house groaned, the sound low and deep, like a living thing shifting in its sleep. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. The entryway I'd come through was now a solid wall, the carvings on it twisting and writhing like they were alive. My flashlight dimmed, plunging the room into near darkness. Panic set in. I stumbled through the halls, searching for a way out. Every door I opened led to another room, each one more warped and decayed than the last. The furniture was broken, the walls covered in more carvings, the air thick with an oppressive heat. Then the floor began to move. It shifted beneath me, rippling like the surface of a pond. I fell to my knees, the wood soft and pulsing under my hands. A low, rhythmic thudding filled the air, steady and unrelenting. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't just a sound, it was a heartbeat. Desperate, I pushed open a door and found myself in a large circular room. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and clouded. In the center of the room was a trapdoor, its edges glowing faintly. The heartbeat was louder here, reverberating through my chest. I didn't want to open it, but I didn't have a choice. The trapdoor was heavy, but it lifted with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The air that rose from below was warm and wet, carrying a sickly sweet smell. I descended slowly, the light from my flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. At the bottom was the heart of the house. It was massive, filling the cavernous space, its surface slick and pulsating. Veins stretched across the walls, pulsing with a faint red glow. The heartbeat was deafening now, shaking the very ground beneath me. "Help me!" The voice was faint but clear. I turned and saw a face emerging from the wall. It was Mr. Carver. His features were twisted, his eyes wide with terror as the wall seemed to absorb him. "Please!" he begged, his voice cracking. "Get out before it's too late." I ran. The house shifted around me, the halls twisting and warping. Doors appeared and vanished, the carvings on the walls glowing and pulsing like veins. I don't remember how I found my way out. One moment I was running through the endless maze of rooms, and the next I was lying on my front lawn, gasping for air. The house was dark and silent, its windows empty. I tried to tell myself it was over, that it had been a nightmare or a hallucination. But the next morning, I found something carved into my front door. "You're next." I moved away a week later, but I can still hear the heartbeat sometimes. It's faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it's there. And I know it's waiting for me to come back.